Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on something that affects all of us, the very evidence your doctor uses to make, life or death decisions.
I mean, it seems like a pretty simple question, doesn't it? But believe it or not, the answer has been at the center of this really fierce debate in medicine for over 30 years.
So on the surface, this idea of evidence-based medicine, or EBM for short, seems like a total no-brainer. Of course, doctors should use the best available evidence to treat you, right? It's simple. Who could possibly argue with that?
Well, it turns out, in the early 90s, a pretty influential group of researchers did exactly that. They launched this huge campaign for what they called a new paradigm for medicine, and it was one that was going to change how we think about evidence forever. Okay, let's dive in.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with what EBM actually is. Then, we'll look at some of its biggest wins, its greatest hits. After that, we'll dig into where the data falls short and some of the, unintended consequences. And finally, we'll talk about the future of evidence.
Okay, so the real core of this whole EBM movement back in the 90s, it wasn't just about using evidence. No, it was about creating a really strict hierarchy of what counts as good evidence.
The new thinking was this: hard data, we're talking large clinical trials, systematic reviews, that stuff should trump everything else. A doctor's personal judgment, their years of experience, even their fundamental understanding of how a disease works, all of that suddenly got pushed down to a lower tier of evidence. It was a pretty radical idea.
And look, let's be totally clear here. This new focus on objective data, it had a powerful and, in a lot of ways, an overwhelmingly positive impact on medicine. We've got to give credit where credit is due.
Maybe the most famous thing to come out of the EBM movement is the Cochrane collaboration. And this thing is incredible. It's this massive global effort. We're talking about 40,000 volunteers from all over the world who are just constantly sifting through all the medical evidence to create these super important reviews.
And this is a perfect example of the movement's success, right? It helped create the very clinical guidelines your doctor uses today. It fought for transparency from drug companies, a huge deal, to get all the data from their trials. And it forced us all to ask a really, really important question. Is more medicine always better?
But this is where we see the other edge of that sword. What happens when the so-called gold standard of evidence, the big randomized clinical trial, has its own pretty serious problems?
You see, clinical trials, they often leave out the very people who need the treatment the most. Take heart attacks, for instance. Patients over 75, they're more than a third of the cases, but they're only 9% of the people in the trials. Women are often underrepresented. And if you've got multiple chronic conditions at once, forget about it, you're almost always excluded. So here's the kicker. The so-called best evidence might not apply at all to the actual person sitting in the doctor's office.
This is a big one. Averages can totally hide life-saving truths. Just look at this trial for a heart attack drug called metoprolol. The overall result? No significant benefit. But when you dig into the data, you find something amazing. For the highest-risk patients, it cut the death rate in half. If you only looked at the average, you would have completely missed this. You'd have thrown out a life-saving drug.
Or how about this one, a 44% reduction in deaths? That sounds incredible, right? You'd say, sign me up. But then you look at the actual numbers from this aspirin trial. For every 1,000 people you treat, you prevent 6 deaths, but you cause 8 cases of severe bleeding. All of a sudden, the right call isn't so obvious, is it? And this brings up a really critical point.
The whole EBM movement has this intense focus on something called statistical significance. Basically, proving a result wasn't just some random fluke. And that's important, but it can completely overshadow what's clinically significant. In other words, does this result actually make a meaningful difference in the life of a real person? The data alone, it can't always tell you that.
So this over-reliance on certain kinds of data, especially the stuff that's easy to count, ended up creating some really serious unintended consequences for medical progress.
Let me tell you a story. It's about Archie Cochrane, who was a real hero of the EBM movement. Back in the 70s, he fought tooth and nail against creating specialized coronary care units, CCUs, for heart attack patients. Why? Because he argued there was no hard evidence they actually worked.
So what did he do? He designed a trial. The question was simple enough. Is care at home better than care in a hospital CCU? And the metric he used to measure success was even simpler. Death. I mean, it's the easiest thing to count, right? Well, the trial found no difference in who lived or died. And because of this gold standard evidence, the UK government actually put the brakes on developing these specialized units.
But here's the twist, and it's an incredible, almost tragic one. By focusing only on that one, simple, easy-to-measure outcome, the trial completely missed the real value of these units. See, they weren't just for treating patients, they were these amazing incubators for research. These CCUs were the very places where the science was being done that led to the huge megatrials that would eventually transform cardiology and, literally, save millions of lives.
And this bias of the easily measurable, as it's called, it's still with us today. We have a system that is fantastic at telling us if a new pill or a new gadget works, but it leaves these huge complex areas, like health policy or how to run a hospital, in a total evidence vacuum. So EBM's greatest strength, its focus on hard data, kind of became its greatest weakness. It created these massive blind spots that actually held back progress.
So, where does all this leave us? I mean, the goal isn't to just throw out evidence-based medicine. That would be like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The goal has to be to evolve it, to make it better.
The path forward, really, it seems to require a much more balanced approach. It means we have to start seeing a patient's individual story as a critical piece of evidence in itself. It means we need to widen the scope beyond just pills to look at complex health policies. It means EBM has to stay fiercely independent from money and politics. And crucially, it means recognizing that evaluating what we already know is a totally different job from the scientific discovery of things we don't know.
You know, in the end, it really all comes back to this piece of wisdom from Sir William Osler from over 100 years ago. The data, the clinical trials, think of those as the books, the maps. They're absolutely essential for the journey. But the patient is the sea itself, complex, unpredictable, and the entire reason we even make the voyage in the first place.
So, it's a question worth asking, right? Because the best answer isn't just buried in the data. It's found somewhere in that delicate balance between the hard-won certainties of science and the complex, undeniable reality of what it means to be human.